Caleb Cohoe from the Metropolitan State University in Denver, and the title of his talk is Forms, Essences, and Superessences, the Reflexivity of Human and Divine Nous in Aristotle. If you're joining us on Zoom, just a reminder, there is a handout which is available for download in the folder which was emailed to you, and it's on the conference website. And for those of you who are kicking it old school, there's a handout on paper if you don't have it yet, which can be sent around if you don't have it yet. So let's welcome Caleb.
Thank you, and thanks to Therese and all the organizers for putting together such a great conference and program. So I'm going to be picking up on some of the same text that we already saw this morning, Jonathan, but I'm going to start at the top and with Aristotle's ultimate being, and then come back to human understanding and get summoned to questions of reflexivity, and then work back up to the divine. In your handout, there's 2 pages of outline, then a cool chart that we'll get to, and then the texts start on the 3rd page of the handout. And I'll refer to those as we go. So in Lambda 9, Aristotle famously claims that Nous, understanding or reason, which he identifies with Theos, the God, Aristotle's divine and ultimate being, must be actively understanding the best thing. This, of course, turns out to be itself. So on page 3, text A, which just is Lambda 9, section 5, we get Aristotle's central claim about Nous itself, or first Nous, as I'll call it. It is itself, therefore, that it understands. And its activity of understanding is an activity of understanding of active understanding. I think that's all clear, so we can just go on. So this is Aristotle's fullest description of first Nous as the activity which consists in understanding itself. But what's this formulation supposed to do? How do we understand he noesis, noeseos, noesis? How could this cover all of reality if its only object is itself? And is this claim about the reflexivity of noesis, the identity of subject and object, or something else? And generally, interpreters have taken one of 2 lines. Option 1 insists that this first Nous is exclusively concerned with itself, while in option 2, it turns out that the object of this Nous is in fact all essences. And on one version, this Nous covers each intelligible form individually, while on the other, it has some kind of unified understanding of all essences insofar as they form a system. I think there are problems with both of these options. So option 1, where Nous just knows itself, looks like in restricting divine understanding, the God's knowing may turn out to be vacuous or limited. So W.D. Ross famously worries that we end up with, quote, the impossible and barren ideal of a knowledge with no object but itself. Doesn't sound great. But I think there are serious problems with option 2, even though a lot of recent interpreters have favored it. This view where Nous knows multiple essences. There are a bunch of problems, including the fact that it lacks textual support, makes the ultimate being dependent on other distinct beings and forms, and more broadly, I think implies a number of things about understanding in the divine that go against important Aristotelian commitments. So in this talk, I'm going to work towards a new and better version of option 1 by introducing the notion of what I called in the title a superessence, an essence that just in being what it is implies other essences that are dependent on it. And on my reading, as the ontological basis for all other essences and beings, the first Nous understands them insofar as it understands itself. And so Aristotle's formulation in Lambda 9 of noesis, noesios, noesis is in fact set up to deny a real distinction between noetic subject and object in this case. But to understand what this means, I'm going to lay out and consider an objection Plotinus makes that I think Lloyd already referred to this morning, to the idea that Nous could be the ultimate independent being, based on this idea that noetic activity involves duality. Now, that might seem a little anachronistic. Obviously, Plotinus is writing centuries later. But he is, as Stephen Menn notes, developing one side of certain ideas about Nous in forms in the Timaeus, in contrast to the way that Aristotle himself responds to some of Plato's ideas. And I think it'll be helpful because a key claim at issue is how to understand this sameness principle we've already been considering in Jonathan's talk, the idea that the knower in the act of knowing is the same as the thing known. And in some ways, this is just a special version of general Aristotelian principles on causation. But the way that it applies and is qualified in these intellectual cases is really important, I think, both for understanding what's different about human self-understanding and divine self-understanding, and then trying to get a grasp on why Aristotle thinks there can be a kind of Nous, the first Nous, that is entirely simple. So we'll look into that principle, but first we need to consider the context of lambda 9 and why I think many current interpretations aren't really in a position to answer this worry that the late great Platonist puts forward. So I'll pick up my interpretive discussion of lambda 9 with section 3 on your handout under text A, where we get two arguments that the being or substance of Nous cannot be in any way a dunamis, a capacity. So, section 3. First then, if the substance of Nous is not an activity of understanding, but a capacity, it's reasonable to suppose that the continuity of its active understanding is laborious for it. Next, it's clear that something else would be more valuable than the understanding, namely, what is understood. So, if Nous were a dunamis, Aristotle claims, this would mean that its activity is a kind of labor, which would be a problem in two ways. Theta 8 argues that laborious capacities cannot always be exercised, but any ceasing would make this divine being worse, and so not the best thing. But even if Nous did manage to continue understanding in this laborious way, that would mean its activity would not be attended with pleasure, contrary to the claims about the divine life we get in lambda 7. And then we get this suggestion that if Nous were a dunamis, its object, what it understands, ta noumenon, would be better than it. Now this comes from Aristotle's general view that the objects that activate or exercise capacities play a primary role in making the activity good or bad. The object is what gives the capacity determination and actuality, making it more fully what it is. So just as the fulfillment of sight for Aristotle lies in seeing the best visible objects, so the fulfillment of understanding would be understanding the best things. The capacity's goal is the activity that completes it, and the object is what allows for this activity to happen. And this gives the object a certain priority over the capacity, because it's the object that actually makes the capacity understand. And this raises a worry for Aristotle's claim that Nous actively understands what is most divine and most valuable. While that initially seemed to guarantee that Nous would be best, since it has the best object, it now leads to this further problem, that maybe it's not Nous itself that is divine and best, but what it understands, ta noumenon. As Arya Kosman notes, and this is number 3 on page 1 of your handout, if the nature of thinking's object were what makes thinking divine, it is that which would be divine, and not simply thinking. In such case, the object would replace thinking as the divine. And I think Kosman identifies a serious problem here that interpreters haven't always properly addressed. If we say that Nous is best because of the object it takes on, then being understood becomes more valuable to meoteron than the nous understanding it. And simply saying that divine thinking has as its object itself, divine thinking, does not dissolve the difficulty. If you think of a case when a human, Socrates, say, understands himself, the human as object of understanding has priority over the human as subject. As subject, Socrates is defined by what he understands, with the human essence determining and controlling his activity. And this is the kind of worry that Aristotle himself raises further on in Lambda 9, section 6 of that text on your handout. If to understand and to be understood are distinct, in virtue of which of them does the good belong to the understanding, Nous? For the being for an activity of understanding is not the same as the being for a thing understood. Here Aristotle raises a serious worry about how simple any activity of nous can be. What it is to be understanding and what it is to be understood seem different. But first nous, if it is to be self-understanding, must essentially involve both. Nous as such was assumed to be best and most divine, but now it turns out to have two aspects. If they're distinct and both make nous what it is, then one or both must be superior to nous, contrary to the fundamental premise of Lambda 9. And so I've set up this problem as a revised dilemma. Number 3 on your handout. I'm not going to go through the dilemma, but hopefully the problem will become clear. And also in the version of the paper I posted, I have some discussion of why I think Arya Kosman's own solution doesn't work and some problems with the system of essences view. But I'm going to focus on the objection from Plotinus and then my own reading of these passages, and we can come back to other interpretations in the Q&A. So to understand Aristotle's view of first nous, we need to look at the objections he puts forward to it and then how he responds. And this is where reflexivity comes in. We see Aristotle using some general claims about the relationship between cognizer and cognized objects to set up this objection to the characterization of nous as self-understanding. So this is section 6 on your handout, under text A on page 4. It appears, though, that scientific knowledge, episteme, perception, opinion, and thinking are always of something else, and of themselves only as a byproduct, paragon. Further, if to understand and to be understood are distinct, in virtue of which of them does the good belong to it? So here the problem Aristotle is pointing to is that none of these cognitive activities seem able to be about themselves directly. So I can see myself in a mirror, or I can hear myself speaking right now. But in these cases, what I'm perceiving, kathotal, in virtue of themselves, are my color and shape, or the timbre and duration of my voice, my special and common perceptible qualities. I perceive myself, kata symbebikos, incidentally, because my perception is first of these perceptible qualities, and only in a further way about me. And even in the case of nous, Aristotle thinks that for humans, I can only understand myself in virtue of having understood some other thing. Because, and this is what we saw in Jonathan's talk, it's through my activity of understanding something else, through being active in that way, that I come to be in a position to reflect on my own nature as an understanding thing. So this is text C on your handout from De Anima 3:4 on self-understanding, where Aristotle says, when, and you can compare this translation with Jonathan's, when the understanding has thus become each thing in the way in which the person scientifically knowing is said to be actively scientifically knowing. Even then, it's still in a way in capacity, although not in the same way as before the person learned or discovered, and then it's able to understand itself. And it's that last claim that I'm focusing on. Because when the human understanding is in a purely receptive state, as he thinks human nous is before these activities of learning and discovering, it can't understand itself. It only is when it has an object that it's actively understood that it can also understand itself by grasping what it's doing in understanding the other object, in being active in this way. And this is where I'm very much on board with this morning's talk. So it's through being directed towards another object that there can then be a reflexive turn to the self. But if that's how nous works, then you might worry that there can't be a case of pure self-understanding with no mediating object. And this is where I want to bring in a couple key objections from Plotinus that emphasize the idea that there's always duality between subject and object. Now, Plotinus adopts many features of Aristotle's model of nous, including the idea that henoesis and ton noumenon form a unity. But although there's a unity there, Plotinus thinks they must always remain distinct, even in the case of active self-understanding. So from Aeneid 5:6, I think this is maybe the one quote that isn't on your handout, sorry. He says, "There's a difference between one thing understanding another and something understanding itself. The latter goes further towards escaping being two. If it has what it understands as itself, so that it may understand authentically, the two will be one. It must therefore be one and a pair. But if it is, on the other hand, one and not two, it will not have something to understand, so that it will not be understanding. It must then be simple and not simple." So while Plotinus agrees that the activity of self-understanding involves oneness and is more one than the activity of understanding any other object, he insists that it must still involve duality. So if there were no difference between subject and object, there would be no content to the activity, because the thing understanding would lack anything to understand. So on his view, to understand myself, I have to consider myself as object, which requires some differentiating of myself as the one understanding and myself as the one being understood. Now, this differentiation is minimal, and it's less than in any other cognitive case. Where, as discussed, when I'm perceiving myself, or perceiving my body, I'm seeing a body that happens to be my own, but it's not that different than perceiving another body. Or think of a doctor healing herself. In that case, it just so happens that the body being healed through the medical art is the doctor's own, but that doesn't make any difference to the operation. The doctor isn't more effective on herself than others. But there's a stronger sameness in this self-understanding case. When I understand myself, or in general, when a particular essence understands itself, both parts of the understanding share the same account. So that the essence understood, when Socrates is understanding himself, is the same as the essence understanding. But Plotinus thinks they must have distinct relations. And as I read him, Plotinus thinks this is analytically true of understanding. So this is page 2 on your handout, number 8. I do have this text on there. He says, "It's necessary for what understands, when it understands, to be in two parts, and either one must be external to the other, or both must be in the same. And the activity of understanding must necessarily always be both in otherness and in sameness, and the proper objects of understanding must be the same and other in relation to the understanding." So I read the two parts here as the subject doing the understanding and the object being understood. They must both be in nous, otherwise understanding will not take place. Since self-understanding requires both the activity of understanding and the passion of being understood to be in one and the same thing, which is self-understanding. If they're not the same as nous by sharing its essence, their presence would not produce self-understanding. But at the same time, they must be other in relation to nous, since noetic activity essentially involves this distinction between subject and object, between content and the thing cognitively grasping the content. And this is why Plotinus thinks the one in itself will, in the proper sense, be neither something understanding nor something understood. When we attribute self-understanding to something, Plotinus thinks we're automatically committed to thinking that it requires noesis and its corresponding object, ta noumenon, to understand itself. And so this thing would need these aspects to avoid being ignorant and be dependent on them in a way the ultimate being cannot be. But for Aristotle, of course, nous is the ultimate being. And so I'm going to explore how I think Aristotle at least tries to get around this idea that nous essentially involves duality. So I think in lambda, Aristotle is distinguishing the first nous, which has itself as object without any mediation, from our reflective noetic activities, which are dependent on mediating objects. In other cases, the being of the understanding is different than the understood. But in the divine case, there's no distinction at all. So it is unity that Aristotle appeals to as he responds to the objection in Lambda 9, but I think we're going to need to unpack that and get more into this sameness principle to understand what's going on. So this is section 7 of text A, Lambda 9. Aristotle says, or is it that in some cases the scientific knowledge, episteme, is the thing? In the case of the productive sciences, isn't it the substance and the essence without the matter? In the case of the theoretical sciences, isn't it the account, the thing, and its active understanding? In the cases, then, where the thing understood and the active understanding of it are not distinct, namely in those where the thing understood has no matter, they will be the same, and the active understanding will be one with the thing understood. So, in his rejoinder here, Aristotle appeals to the identity that holds between the one knowing a theoretical science and the objects of that science. But how does bringing in episteme and the object-knower identity help? After all, as we've seen already, Aristotle uses this language of sameness between cognizer and cognized in a bunch of different cases where there is a real distinction between them, such as perception. On my reading, Aristotle in this passage asserts a stronger claim of identity that only obtains in the case of theoretical sciences about things whose essences are separate from matter. So there is this sense in which perceiving and being perceived are together, as Aristotle discusses in De Anima 3.2, that was the passage on Jonathan's handout. But the object is the same as the activity only insofar as it's in the perceiver. So the paleness in Coriscus is not the same in being as the paleness in my sight when I'm seeing his pallor. So I look, hopefully Stephen doesn't mind being called pale, but you know, there's some kind of form of color, yeah, there. But the status the form has in that material being is different than the status it has when I receive it as a perceiver. I think for Aristotle, I can be said to have the form in me, but it's in me in a different way than it is in him. And even in the case of theoretical knowledge, when the object known is something essentially unmattered, like snub or horse, or even in the case of mathematical objects, there is a distinction between the form in the cognizer, a form that's being actively understood, and is the form activating and actually understanding being, and the form as it is in the external thing. The intelligible form of snub or horse or triangle that my mind grasps and has been separated from matter is not the same in being as the form of snub or horse or circle in their unmattered existence in Socrates or Bucephalus or a perfect shamrock. even though they're one in form, because the identity of cognizer and cognized is incomplete. So I think there's this general principle, but the way it applies in all these cases is different for different types. And that's where I had a go at trying to say what's the same and different in this chart on page 3. So you have the type of cognition, and then the next 2 columns there are about what's going on out in the object, as it were. So in the case of perceptible things, they are perceived in capacity. That's just what it means for them to be perceptible, but they're never actively perceiving themselves, except incidentally in some cases. So when I'm seeing Stephen's, very pleasant skin tone, I'm seeing something that is in fact a perceiver, because I think he's probably seeing right now, if I'm not mistaken. But that's accidental, katasomebikos, to his status as a visible object. The fact that Stephen happens to be perceiving doesn't actually change his status as visible from, say, the whiteness in this pen, which is visible but not perceiving at all. And then the last 2 columns are about the status within the cognizer when it's actively cognizing. So I'm just focusing on the active case, not the case of developed capacity. And here, on my reading of Aristotle, we can say, in a way, that the cognizer is F, or actively is using the form of whatever they're cognizing, but the status of that form, in the case of perception and understanding of natural and mathematical beings, is different in the cognizer than it is in the thing cognized. But that's what changes in the 3rd and 4th rows, where we get to understanding of immaterial essences and human self-understanding. Because there, in that case, when we're actively understanding things in this way, we're actively understanding things that are themselves both actively understanding and actively understood. So we see this in text D on your handout, where Aristotle is discussing the way in which Nous is itself intelligible. He says at the end of that text, it's an understood object in just the way its understood objects are, since in the case of those things that have no matter, what understands and what is understood are the same. So the idea here is that in grasping the divine intelligences moving the spheres, I understand something that is itself actively understanding. And so there's a much greater degree of sameness here between my activity of understanding and its object, something which is itself actively understanding. And not just incidentally, rather it's essential both to what that thing is and to my status as cognizing it, that it's actively understanding and that I'm actively understanding it as an actively understanding thing. So my being when I'm understanding such objects is the same as their being in doing the understanding that makes them what they are. And this means that the understood object my nous has taken on is the same as the thing itself, ta pragma. Whereas when my nous takes on the form of horse or earth, those forms are distinct from the things to which they're directed, because the being of horse or earth out there in the world is different than the being in my mind. Now, I think this is a step on the way to seeing how self-understanding could be more perfect, more self-identical. But Aristotle still thinks that human understanding goes from a condition of receptivity, when it's able to understand the unmoved movers, say, but it's not actively doing so, to a condition of activity when it exercises understanding. And since it undergoes this transition, there has to be a cause or explanation that will be prior to the relevant understanding, either the object of understanding itself or something else which allows this object to act on the receptive understanding. And so we still need a distinction between subject and object here. Even if we understand the best, that's not what we are. Humans are creatures capable of understanding, and that's part of our essence. But actual understanding of the divine, say, is something perhaps only a few of us achieve. And while engaged in that activity, there's a sameness between our understanding and what's understood, but this is a qualified sameness that completes the capacity that we have. And here, I think what I'm saying is in line with a theme in John Kelsey's recent work. And I think this is true of our self-understanding as well. In order to understand myself, I first receive my essence as understanding thing, as this byproduct, paragon, of understanding some other object. It enables me to grasp what I am. So even though my activity of understanding is entirely the same as the understood essence, both of these are developments or fulfillments of my essence, not what I always am as such. So by our nature, human knowers, as both subjects and objects, exist in capacity and need to develop into actively understanding with the help of other causes. By contrast, first nous, as pure energeia, has no capacity to be activated. And not only is it always active, it does not need any further cause or feature by which it is understanding. So I think there's a distinction between understanding subject and object there, even in the heavens understanding of the first unmoved mover, as described in Lambda 7. So this is text E on your handout. Section 2, Aristotle says, the understanding actively understands itself by partaking of the understood thing, for it becomes an understood thing by touching and understanding one, so that understanding and understood are the same. For what is receptive of the understood and of the substance is the understanding, and it's active when it possesses it, so that this rather than that seems to be the divine thing that understanding possesses. So here on my reading, Aristotle starts with the understanding that the heavens possess, that ceaselessly moves the heavens insofar as knowing the God makes the God an object of desire. And in this section, Aristotle is not talking about the divine being itself, since the understanding in this passage is described as receptive of the understood object and of the substance. That is, receptive of what I've been calling first nous. And it's in virtue of receiving first nous that the understanding of the heavens becomes an actively understanding thing. So there's still a distinction between object and cognizer in the case of celestial understanding. I follow Andre Laux and C.D.C. Reeve in thinking that Aristotle is claiming that the active self-understanding of the heavens is what seems divine and better because it's more similar to the first nous than the heavens touching and receiving first nous, since this is a case of being acted on, which is less divine. So on my reading, even in this more perfect case, there's still a dependency, and the heavens are still understanding themselves through understanding something else. And I think this is true of the secondary unmoved movers as well, though it's not as clear. So while Aristotle allows for a number of unmoved movers in Lambda 8, he ends up forcefully insisting that there can be only one heaven because, quote, the primary immovable mover is one both in account and in number. And I think this suggests that only one nous is entirely simple. So while these other unmoved movers are going to be intrinsically immovable and eternal, I don't think Aristotle maintains that they need to be nothing but energeia, because his insistence on the oneness of the heavens is based on the oneness of its principle, one first principle, and the denial that it can be multiplied. And in Lambda 10, he likens this first nous to a general ordering his army, suggesting that it's privileged and better than the other unmoved movers. And I think the natural way for this to be the case is that the understanding of all the other unmoved movers is receptive and dependent on first nous for being what it is. Now, these other movers are immovable insofar as they cannot undergo any kinesis and are only dependent on the first nous. But I think only the first unmoved mover is entirely simple understanding, and this is what causes the understanding of all heavenly beings. So their activity is in a way the same as the object, but still qualified because it's dependent on this mover. And then this finally puts us in a position to see what's distinctive of first nous in Lambda 9, where there's no real distinction between object and subject. So in the other cases, Aristotle would agree with Plotinus. The activity of understanding and being understood are distinct, even when united. But in this ultimate case, Aristotle thinks they're one and the same simple thing, and there's no duality. So on my reading, Lambda 9 is developing this idea of an unqualified identity between what understands and what's understood. The divine nous just is the activity of understanding without any receptivity or capacity. There's only a real distinction and priority relations when the understanding in question is receptive, something which either has a capacity that needs to be exercised or whose capacity needs to be activated by its object, as in the human and heavenly cases, respectively. Now, the only way for us to grasp or explicate divine nous is through our own understanding, and so we can't avoid employing a structure that suggests duality. But I read Aristotle's formulation of he noesis, noeseos, noesis as suggesting that there's no real distinction. We should reject the assumption that the being of the activity of understanding is distinct from the being for a thing understood. There's simply understanding itself, exclamation mark, as I put on your chart. It's not that thought thinks thought, and we happen to have one thing taking on these multiple roles. Instead, Aristotle puts the same terms in the subject, predicate, and objective genitive places to indicate that the structure and differentiation in the case of our nous does not apply to the first case. So, that's sort of why I'm opting for option one, but then if we have this divine self-understanding that only knows itself, does this leave us with a solitary, unconnected knower? This is something that Aristotle himself is worried about. We see him criticizing Empedocles for having his divine being not know all things. But I don't think the solution is to build complexity and structure into the divine self-understanding. Instead, I think we need to understand this first nous as a superessence, something whose ways of being and knowing go beyond other things, so that it is only one thing, pure and simple, but as the ontological basis for all other essences and beings, it understands them insofar as it understands itself. This picks up on Aristotle's insistence in Lambda 10 that the God is like a general in being the primary source of goodness for the entities he orders. Quote, "For it is not that such a being is on account of the order, but rather this order is on account of him. The order of material things comes from the God, but the God does not depend on this order." We should say the same thing about essences. The nature and order of essences comes from the first understanding, but they do not constitute nous. Instead, this order and its interconnections are due to the unitary principle that the God is, with all later distinct things, whether essences or the beings they compose, being jointly ordered in relation to one. The God can be this one ordering principle because what the God is grounds everything else. Well, we see this in section 4 of Lambda 7, text E on your handout. where Aristotle says, living too certainly belongs to the God, for the activity of understanding is living, but he is this activity, and his intrinsic activity is the best and eternal living. This is not because the God is active in all the ways that every being is active, or exhibits each and every one of the full range of ways of life. So the God does not use sense organs to perceive or undergo digestive processes. But by being the single best activity, the God is fully living and active, and it's this continuous activity that everything else seeks. But the God doesn't need to share in each deficient and mimetic way of living. By being living itself, the God's living is the cause and principle of the living of all other things. The God would not live more or explain things better if the God also had activities that could be otherwise or that fulfilled capacities. And on my account, just the same is true of Nous considered as cognizer. It would not be better if it somehow had multiple objects and ways of knowing. Instead, its perfect self-understanding sets the standard and model for everything else. The one entirely perfect superessence which it contemplates allows for knowledge of everything else by being a cause of everything that comes after. While this view of the divine understanding as a superessence, which understands subsequent essences by understanding itself, is not fully developed in what we have of Aristotle's theology, I think this interpretation respects Aristotle's explicit commitments better than its rivals and follows the pattern of Aristotle's claims about being, living, and activity. Aristotle repeatedly insists that first philosophy or theology gives us knowledge of being not by acquainting us with each individual entity in the cosmos, but by connecting us with a single cause of the whole, the cause in relation to which all things are ordered. If Aristotle thinks our human knowledge of the God allows us to encompass all of reality in a way, then the first Nous' own much more perfect and unitary self-understanding will also prove much more encompassing. Not because it includes as parts various essences, but because it causes and explains them all just by being the perfect living activity that it is. We need to know other essences because our human essence and being is limited. And we can only become aware of what we ourselves are through the kind of reflection that understanding of other forms enables. We need to understand multiple different essences and the order between them in order to grasp how reality hangs together and how substances and accidents relate. And we need to understand ourselves in relation to other forms of life, both plants and animals and supralunary bodies and intelligences. But first Nous' unitary superessence is so perfect that adding in anything or bringing in subsequent essences would make this understanding worse rather than better. The reflexivity of divine understanding is also inherent to its very act of understanding, not a byproduct. This superessence just is self-understanding without any duality. So my interpretation shows how Aristotle's divine Nous can be a perfect knower, grasping all things while still being independent of all other beings and entirely simple. By being first and best, God already knows everything. Thanks.